They told us it was one of the most dramatic moments in all of Scripture, the kind of story that preachers retell with pounding voices, and Sunday school teachers animate with cardboard trumpets and shouts of victory. A story where the people of God march around the ancient city of Jericho once a day for 6 days, then on the 7th day circle it 7 times, blow their trumpets, and watch as the massive stone walls collapse in a divine show of power, clearing the way for Joshua's army to take the city without even lifting a sword against its defenses. And for many of us growing up hearing this, the imagery was so vivid we could almost feel the dust from those tumbling stones sting our eyes. But what if I told you that, despite the thousands of sermons and paintings and dramatizations, there is no evidence that this event ever happened, and in fact, the actual archaeological record says something profoundly different, something that raises questions that ripple far beyond Jericho itself. Because when you dig beneath the surface of this story, literally, you discover that the entire scene might have been more of a national myth than a historical account. And if that is true, it means a cornerstone of faith-based storytelling might rest on nothing but sand. So let us go back to the ruins themselves, because Jericho is real, and archaeologists have been studying it for over a century. And this is where the shock begins, because the famous biblical event is placed in the late Bronze Age by the traditional biblical timeline, somewhere around the 13th century before Christ. But when excavators like John Garstang and later Kathleen Kenyon studied the actual layers of Jericho's ruins, they found that the city's massive fortifications had indeed been destroyed. Only the timing was wrong by hundreds of years, with the destruction layer dating to around 1550 before Christ, during the Middle Bronze Age, centuries before Joshua and his army would have supposedly arrived, which means by the time of Joshua, the city did not even have walls to fall. It was at most a small unfortified settlement, or possibly abandoned altogether. And this is not a fringe claim, but the overwhelming consensus of mainstream archaeology. Yet for generations, pastors and teachers have repeated the story as unquestionable truth. So why does this matter so much? Some might say it is just one story, but here is the deeper problem. If Jericho's walls fell long before Joshua's conquest, then the biblical narrative of a miraculous military victory as proof of divine promise begins to look less like history and more like theological fiction designed to inspire national identity centuries later. And this raises a painful but necessary question. How much of what we accept as literal biblical history is actually the product of later writers crafting a powerful origin story? And how many of us have built parts of our faith on moments that were never meant to be understood as factual events at all? Because when we confront the Jericho problem, we also confront the way ancient cultures told stories. They were not writing modern history, but national epics. And the book of Joshua may be less a battle report and more an Israelite equivalent of the Homeric tales. Yet here is where it gets even more unsettling, because the lack of evidence is not just absence, it is contradiction. The destruction layer at Jericho contains Canaanite pottery styles and Egyptian artifacts from the time of the Hyksos expulsion, which match a completely different historical context, meaning that if Israelite forces had been there centuries later, there should be entirely different cultural remains, and there are none. So either the Israelites somehow managed to take a city without leaving any trace of their presence, no weapons, no pottery, no signs of a new population, or the battle never took place at all. And here is the chilling reflection. If one of the most famous examples of God fighting for His people is archaeologically invisible, what does that do to the foundation of those sermons we have heard since childhood? The ones that told us to march around our problems like Joshua marched around Jericho, believing that faith and obedience would make the walls fall. And if the walls never fell in history, does that mean the lesson is void? Or does it mean the lesson was never supposed to be based on history in the first place? And if so, why did no one tell us? The deeper we go, the more this turns from a curiosity into a crisis of trust, because when archaeology and text diverge, believers are forced to choose between reinterpreting the text or rejecting the evidence, and that choice is not easy, especially for those raised to believe that every word of the Bible is literal history. And yet the irony is that facing this reality does not have to destroy faith. It can refine it, but only if we are willing to be honest about what the evidence says. Because the truth is that Jericho is a test case for the entire conquest narrative in the book of Joshua, and here is the twist. Jericho is not the only city with this problem. Other so-called conquests like Ai and Hazor also show archaeological timelines that do not match the biblical account, which suggests that the whole sweeping campaign described in Joshua may be a compressed, stylized memory of smaller skirmishes or gradual settlement over generations, later rewritten as a lightning war of divine judgment. And that reframing changes everything, because instead of a miraculous overnight conquest, we have the slow emergence of Israelite identity from among the Canaanite peoples, which is a story of cultural evolution rather than supernatural warfare. But the storytellers of ancient Israel may have recast this gradual process into the dramatic imagery of walls falling down and enemies fleeing to create a sense of divine favor and destiny. And perhaps this is why the Jericho story survived, not because it was history, but because it was a powerful metaphor. Yet here is where I challenge you directly. If a metaphor is told as history for centuries, and only in modern times do we discover it is not literal, what responsibility do we have to correct the record, or will we keep teaching it as if the evidence does not exist? And if we keep teaching it, is that faith or is it denial? And now I want you to think about something else. Jericho's story is often used to rally courage in the face of impossible odds, but what happens when the odds we are fighting are not walls of stone but walls of false certainty? Is it possible that the real battle is not against the ruins of an ancient city, but against the ruins of unquestioned tradition? And if so, will you have the courage to walk around those walls and let them fall? Not because God smashed them with a trumpet blast, but because truth smashed them with the weight of reality. This is only the first of 7 stories, but it is enough to show that when we dig deep, we may not find what we were told to expect. And maybe that is the point. Maybe faith built only on untested stories is fragile, but faith built on facing the truth is unshakable. And if Jericho teaches us anything now, it is that we must be ready to ask hard questions, because if we cannot do that, we will never see the bigger picture that the rest of these stories reveal. And trust me, the next ones are even more unsettling because they involve miracles, prophecies, and even scenes from the life of Jesus himself that may never have happened. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. So stay with me as we keep pulling this thread, because by the end of this journey, the tapestry of traditional Bible stories will look very different from what you grew up with. And that is where the real awakening begins. You have heard this story since you were a child, maybe in Sunday school with a felt board and smiling fish cutouts, maybe from a pulpit where the preacher used it as proof that you can never outrun God, maybe in a children's book with bright illustrations of a bearded man sitting calmly inside a cavernous fish belly. But I'm going to tell you something that will make you stop and rethink everything you thought you knew about Jonah and the whale, because the evidence points not to a miraculous survival inside a sea creature's stomach, but to an ancient parable never meant to be taken as literal history. And yet for centuries, millions have been taught that it really happened. And the truth is that if you strip away the assumption of literalism, the story takes on an entirely different meaning, one that is both more challenging and more liberating. So let us begin by looking at the text itself, because the book of Jonah is unlike almost every other prophetic book in the Hebrew. Scriptures, other prophets, are collections of oracles, sermons, and visions, but Jonah is a narrative from start to finish, and it is filled with exaggerated elements that in the ancient literary world were hallmarks of moral tales. The distances are absurdly large for the time, the timelines impossibly compressed, and the imagery blatantly symbolic. Nineveh is said to be a 3-day walk across, which would make it the size of the largest cities of modern times, and yet no archaeological evidence supports such an enormous city in the 8th century before Christ. And the notion of surviving inside the digestive system of a giant fish for 3 days without being crushed, drowned, or dissolved by stomach acid is biologically impossible, not just improbable. And ancient readers were not ignorant of this. They knew what a fish could and could not do, which means they did not see this as a literal sea survival story, but as a piece of satire, because Jonah is not just a reluctant prophet, he is an absurdly reluctant prophet, one whose behavior at every turn is exaggerated for effect. And scholars across traditions have pointed out that the structure of Jonah mirrors other ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean morality tales, stories where a stubborn protagonist resists divine or cosmic instruction and suffers an ironic reversal. But perhaps the most telling clue is the fish itself, which in the Hebrew text is called a dag gadol, literally a great fish, not a whale. And this term was used in folklore to describe mythical sea creatures, often as symbolic stand-ins for chaos or divine intervention, and the way Jonah is vomited onto dry land reads less like a survival log and more like the punchline of an ironic fable. Yet for centuries, religious teachers have fought to preserve the literal reading, in part because Jesus himself references Jonah in the Gospels, calling it the sign of Jonah. But even there, the context is metaphorical. He is comparing Jonah's 3 days in the belly of the fish to his own 3 days in the tomb, meaning that the reference functions symbolically, not as a historical endorsement. And yet here is where the challenge comes in, because for many believers, to suggest Jonah is not literal feels like undermining the words of Christ, and that is why the conversation gets so heated. But if we step back from the fear and look at the historical context, we see that ancient Jewish interpreters themselves often read Jonah allegorically, especially in the centuries leading up to and following the Second Temple period. In fact, the rabbis in later commentary used Jonah to explore themes of repentance, mercy, and God's care for the nations, not to argue about marine biology or miracle survival rates. So why then do so many modern believers insist on literalism? The answer lies partly in the rise of fundamentalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, when defending the Bible as entirely literal history became a rallying cry against modern science. But the irony is that in doing so, defenders ended up flattening the richness of these stories, because Jonah as a parable is far more subversive than Jonah as a news report. Think about it. Here is a prophet who does not want God to forgive his enemies, who runs in the opposite direction, who sulks when his mission succeeds, and who ends the story still angry at God. It is a deeply uncomfortable mirror held up to religious people who think they own God's mercy. And in its original setting, this would have been an explosive challenge to Israelite nationalism, because the Ninevites were not just foreigners, they were Assyrians, the very empire that would eventually crush the northern kingdom. And yet in the story, God cares about them and sends a prophet to warn them so they can repent. If that is not a political and theological bombshell, I do not know what is. And here is the unsettling part. If Jonah is indeed a parable, it means the entire miraculous fish episode was crafted not to dazzle us with divine power over nature, but to make us laugh at the absurd lengths a prophet will go to avoid doing what God says. It is a setup for the real punchline, that God's compassion is bigger than our prejudices. But when we make it literal, we miss the joke. We turn the story into a test of belief in the impossible instead of a test of the heart toward our enemies. And here is where the deception becomes dangerous, because if we insist that the truth of Jonah depends on the historical accuracy of being swallowed by a fish, then when people discover it is biologically and historically impossible, they may throw out the entire message. Whereas if we taught it as the moral satire it was always intended to be, the power of the story would remain intact. And this leads to a deeper reflection. How many other biblical stories have we flattened into literal events when they were meant to be literary provocations? And what does that say about our need for certainty over meaning, about our obsession with defending what cannot be defended, instead of embracing the richness of what actually is? Jonah's story, when stripped of literalism, becomes almost uncomfortably relevant today, because it confronts the tendency of religious communities to guard grace like a private treasure, and it warns us that the God we claim to serve may extend mercy to those we consider enemies, and that our greatest sin may not be disobedience, but resentment toward divine compassion. And this is the part that hits hardest. Jonah never really changes. He ends the story sitting outside the city, furious that God spared it, and God leaves the question hanging, should I not be concerned for Nineveh, with its thousands of people who do not know their right hand from their left, and that ending is no accident? It is an open challenge to the reader, forcing us to answer. And maybe that is why the story survives, because every generation has to confront the Jonah in their own heart. And yet we keep covering it with the distraction of a giant fish, perhaps because it is easier to argue about biology than to face the truth about our own lack of compassion. So let me leave you with this. If Jonah never happened as history, but carries more truth than most literal events, will you still listen to it, or will you dismiss it because it does not fit the model of faith you were taught? The real question is not whether Jonah survived 3 days inside a fish, but whether we can survive 3 minutes of honest self-examination without running the other way. And if you think this story is unsettling, wait until you see what comes next, because our next stop is the Exodus, the grand national origin story of Israel, the foundation of Jewish identity, the event that shaped centuries of theology, and yet the evidence suggests it too never happened the way we were told, and that is where the ground really starts to shake. This is the story that defines an entire people, the one told every year at Passover tables around the world, the one that begins with a nation enslaved in Egypt and ends with their dramatic escape through the parted waters of the Red Sea, their enemies swallowed in the waves while they marched toward freedom under the leadership of Moses, guided by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And for millions, this is not just history, it is the very heartbeat of faith, a story of God, rescuing his people from the most powerful empire of the time. But what if I told you that after centuries of searching, archaeologists and historians have found no evidence that the Exodus ever happened as described in the Bible? Not a trace of millions wandering in the Sinai desert, no signs of a vast population suddenly leaving Egypt, no collapse of Egyptian infrastructure from the loss of such a labor force. And here is the most shocking part. Not only is there no evidence, but the Egyptian records, which are among the most meticulous of the ancient world, are completely silent about any such event. And when we consider that the Egyptians recorded everything from military victories to shipments of grain to the building of minor temples, their silence on the escape of an entire nation is deafening. And before someone says maybe the Egyptians just wanted to hide their embarrassment, remember that they recorded defeats too, often in surprisingly candid ways. So the absence of mention dares not easily explained away. But perhaps the most damning evidence comes from the archaeology of the Sinai Peninsula, because if the Exodus happened literally, with hundreds of thousands or even millions wandering for 40 years, there would be material remains, broken pottery, discarded tools, campfire ash, human burials. And yet, after decades of searching, none of that has been found in the quantities that would even remotely match the biblical account. And this is not just the conclusion of secular scholars. Even some devout archaeologists have admitted that the evidence is missing. So what are we to make of this? One possibility is that the Exodus, as told, is a later national myth, built from smaller memories of migration, slavery, and escape, woven together into a single epic story. And there is a precedent for this in the ancient world, because many cultures crafted legendary origin stories to explain their existence and identity. But for Israel, the Exodus was more than just a tale. It became the foundation of their covenant with God, the reason for their law, their festivals, their understanding of justice and compassion toward the stranger. And if this event did not happen literally, that shakes more than just history. It shakes theology. Yet here is where it gets complicated, because while there is no evidence for a mass departure from Egypt, there is evidence for smaller groups of Semitic peoples living in Egypt at various times, some of whom may have fled or migrated back to Canaan. And these fragments of history could have been remembered, retold, and expanded over centuries until they became the Exodus story we know. And this would explain certain details that match Egyptian history, like the use of Egyptian names such as Moses, which comes from the Egyptian word for child or born, as in Thutmose or Ramesses, and the mention of the city of Pi-Ramesses, which was indeed a major capital during the reign of Ramesses II. But here is the twist. If the Exodus was written centuries after the supposed events, these details could have been added by storytellers familiar with Egyptian history, not as eyewitness testimony, but as narrative coloring to make the story vivid. And this changes the way we see Moses, because in the literal telling, he is the great liberator who stood before Pharaoh and demanded, "Let my people go." But in the historical critical view, he may be a composite figure, a fusion of memories from different leaders, prophets and freedom fighters, woven into one iconic character. And the parting of the Red Sea, or more accurately the Sea of Reeds in the Hebrew text, may have been inspired by a much smaller and more natural event, like a wind set-down phenomenon or a tidal retreat, magnified in the retelling into a cosmic miracle. And if this is the case, then the story of the plagues, the Passover night, the angel of death, all of it, moves from historical event to theological drama. And here is where the real discomfort sets in, because the Exodus is the lens through which so much of the Bible interprets God's relationship to his people. It is quoted in the prophets, remembered in the Psalms, invoked in the Gospels. So if it is not literal, how do we read those later references? Do we see them as based on a shared cultural story rather than a factual one? And if so, Does that diminish their meaning? For some people the answer is yes, for others it is no, but for all of us it forces a confrontation with the way sacred texts use history, because maybe their goal was never to write history in the modern sense, but to create a story that explains who we are and why we exist. And that is what origin myths do. Yet if we call it a myth, many hear that as saying it is false, when in reality myths are vehicles for truth about identity, values and destiny. But here is the dangerous part. When you take a myth and insist it is literal history, you set it up to collapse under the weight of evidence. And when that happens, many lose not just the story but the faith attached to it, which is why these conversations are so charged. But we cannot ignore the fact that the earliest archaeological evidence of Israel in Canaan shows them already living in small highland villages, emerging gradually out of the Canaanite population around the 12th century before Christ, not arriving suddenly from Egypt with a foreign culture, which fits the theory that Israel's origins were largely indigenous to Canaan, and that the Exodus was a later narrative crafted to give them a shared history of liberation. And if that is true, it is both unsettling and fascinating, because it means the central story of deliverance may have been born not out of a single moment of divine intervention, but out of centuries of struggle and adaptation. And yet it still carried enough power to inspire revolutions, abolition movements, and civil rights campaigns thousands of years later, which tells us something profound. Whether or not it happened, the Exodus works, it moves people, it calls them to freedom and justice, and maybe that is why it has survived. But this does not erase the ethical dilemma, because if the story was shaped or even invented for theological purposes, should it still be taught as literal truth? And if not, how do we reframe it without tearing apart the faith structures built upon it? Maybe the answer is to tell the truth about its origins while still honoring its meaning, but that requires a humility that many religious institutions are unwilling to embrace, because it would mean admitting that the foundation of their narrative is not history, but memory. And memories can be powerful, but they are also selective, and they change over time, which is why the Exodus as we have it today may be more about who Israel wanted to be than about what Israel actually experienced. And if we can see that, we can begin to understand the next layer of our investigation, because if the Exodus, the great national liberation story, did not happen as described, then we must ask, what about the smaller, more personal stories in the Bible that we have always assumed were historical, and that leads us to a scene so emotional, so heartbreaking, that its absence from history is almost unbearable to admit? The slaughter of the innocents by King Herod, a moment embedded in the Christmas story itself, and yet, as we will see, it may never have happened at all. It is one of the most haunting scenes in the entire Christmas story, a moment of pure cruelty that contrasts sharply with the joy of angels singing and shepherds rejoicing. The event that Matthew's Gospel says happened shortly after the birth of Jesus, when King Herod, enraged at the news that a newborn child had been proclaimed King of the Jews, ordered the killing of all boys 2 years old, and in Bethlehem and its surrounding area, a massacre meant to eliminate the threat to his throne. And for many of us raised with this story, it is an inseparable part of the Nativity, one of the reasons Joseph fled with Mary and the infant Jesus to Egypt, fulfilling the prophecy, "Out of Egypt I called my son." But what if I told you that this horrific episode, as emotional and shocking as it is found in no other historical record, not in any Roman archive, not in the works of Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, not in any other gospel, not even in later Jewish or Christian traditions until long after Matthew's Gospel was written? And this absence is not a small oversight, it is massive, because Herod the Great was one of the most documented figures in ancient Jewish history, and Josephus in particular gives us excruciatingly detailed accounts of Herod's life and reign, listing his building projects, his political alliances, his acts of brutality, his paranoia, even the individual executions of his family members. And yet there is no mention of a massacre in Bethlehem, no hint of soldiers killing infants, no ripple effect from such an event. And here is why that silence is so strange, because the Romans and Herod's administration kept meticulous records of significant actions, especially those that involved political unrest or the use of military force. And an act like this, even if Bethlehem was a small village, would have been deeply unsettling to the region, likely provoking outrage or fear that would be recorded somewhere. Yet the historical record is completely silent. And this raises the unsettling possibility that the slaughter of the innocents never happened at all, that it was a literary creation by Matthew to connect the story of Jesus to the story of Moses. Because in Exodus, Pharaoh orders the killing of Hebrew infants to prevent the rise of a deliverer, and Jesus in Matthew is presented as the new Moses, the ultimate deliverer, so the massacre becomes a narrative bridge, a way of tying Jesus' life to Israel's history. But here is where it gets even more intriguing. Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth was likely a small rural settlement, with maybe a few hundred residents at most. So even if such a massacre had occurred, the number of infants killed would have been relatively small, perhaps fewer than 20. And some defenders of the story argue that this could explain the lack of historical mention. But this argument has a fatal flaw. Josephus recorded other events of similar or even smaller scale if they reflected Herod's cruelty or paranoia. So the idea that he would omit this entirely is highly implausible, especially when we know that Josephus delighted in portraying Herod as a violent, untrustworthy ruler, which means this massacre would have been perfect ammunition for his narrative, yet he says nothing. And that silence grows louder when we realize that the Gospel of Luke, which also tells the nativity story and gives us the census and the shepherds, makes no mention of it either. And Luke was not shy about portraying political danger to Jesus and his family. So if this event had been known in early Christian circles, why leave it out? The more we look, the more it appears that Matthew's account is a theological construction rather than a historical report, designed to portray Jesus as fulfilling prophetic patterns, particularly the passage from Jeremiah about Rachel weeping for her children, a prophecy about the Babylonian exile that Matthew reinterprets as being fulfilled in Bethlehem. And this fits with Matthew's broader writing style, which frequently presents events in Jesus' life as fulfillments of Hebrew scripture, sometimes in ways that reframe or even alter the original context. But this raises a question that cuts deep. If the slaughter of the innocents never happened, what does that do to our understanding of the early life of Jesus? And if part of the Christmas story is a symbolic invention, how much of it is history and how much is theological artistry? For some believers, this feels like an attack on the sanctity of Scripture, but it is actually a call to read the Gospels for what they are, ancient theological biographies, not modern journalism. And when we see that, we begin to appreciate their meaning in a new way, though it also forces us to acknowledge that they sometimes reshape history to fit a spiritual narrative, which can be disorienting for those who have been taught that every detail is a factual record. But this is where faith meets the hard edge of historical reality, and it is not comfortable because now we must ask, if this story is not literal, does it still carry value? And the answer is yes, if we allow it to speak in its symbolic register, as a warning about the brutality of political power, as a reminder that innocence is often the first victim of tyranny, as an echo of Israel's suffering in the past, and a lens through which to see the kind of world into which Jesus was born. But we must be honest about its likely origins, because if we keep presenting it as unquestionable history, we set people up for a crisis of faith when they discover the silence of the historical record. And this brings us to an even larger problem, because if we admit that Matthew may have created an event to fit a prophetic mold, then we must consider that other parts of the gospel narratives may have been shaped in similar ways, and that leads to a story that is even older and even more global than Christianity itself, a story of catastrophe and survival that has been told in dozens of cultures, the story of a worldwide flood, the tale of Noah's Ark, which we were taught was the ultimate act of divine judgment and mercy, but which, when examined closely, turns out to have no basis in global history. And that is where we are headed next, because the flood story might just be the most universally retold event that never happened. It is one of the most dramatic and widely recognized stories in the Bible, a tale of judgment and survival that has shaped art, literature, and theology for centuries. The account of a world so wicked that God decided to wipe it clean with a flood, sparing only Noah, his family, and the animals he gathered into a massive ark. And for many, this is not just a biblical story but a historical fact, a catastrophe that explains geological features, fossil records, and even the diversity of species on Earth. But when we strip away centuries of tradition and examine the evidence, the truth is that there is no sign such a global flood ever happened. And in fact, everything we know from geology, archaeology, and ancient history points to the opposite, because the Earth's layered sediments show no indication of a worldwide deluge in the time frame the Bible suggests, and the diversity of human civilizations, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, shows uninterrupted development during the period when such a flood would have supposedly wiped them out, which means these cultures did not experience the cataclysm the story describes. And even more telling, the fossil record, far from showing a single layer of mixed remains deposited by a global flood, reveals a slow and orderly progression of life forms over millions of years, a pattern completely incompatible with a sudden worldwide disaster that buried all life at once. So where did the Noah story come from? The answer lies in the ancient flood myths that existed long before the Hebrew scriptures were written, most notably the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, which contains an account of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, with a chosen man warned to build a large boat, bring his family and animals aboard, and release birds to find dry land, a story with striking similarities to Noah's, and archaeological evidence suggests that these flood legends were inspired not by a global event, but by massive regional floods in the ancient Near East, particularly in the Mesopotamian river valleys, where sudden flooding from the Tigris and Euphrates could devastate entire cities, and for the people of that time, the destruction would have seemed world-ending. So the memory of such events grew into myths that spread across cultures, eventually being adapted into the Hebrew narrative as the story of Noah. And yet the biblical version adds unique theological elements, portraying the flood as a moral judgment on human wickedness and the ark as a sign of God's mercy toward the righteous. But here is the uncomfortable part. When we insist that Noah's flood is a literal global event, we run into impossible logistical problems, such as fitting millions of species onto a single wooden ship, feeding them for over a year, managing waste, and then redistributing them to every corner of the earth, all without leaving genetic bottlenecks that would be obvious in the DNA of every living creature today. And none of these issues have plausible solutions without invoking constant miracles, which ironically undermines the original purpose of the story as a moral warning and turns it into a test of belief in the impossible. And yet, if we accept that the flood narrative is drawn from ancient Near Eastern myth, it takes on a different and perhaps even richer meaning, one that speaks to the universal human fear of destruction and the hope for survival. And this is where the story still holds power, because it is about the fragility of life, the consequences of human violence, and the possibility of starting again. But for that to resonate fully in the modern world, we must tell the truth about its origins. And that truth is this: there was no worldwide flood in human history. Noah's Ark never floated above the mountains. The rainbow at the end was never a new covenant written in the sky after a watery apocalypse. But the story is still worth hearing, if we can hear it as an ancient parable rather than a historical account. And maybe this is the real challenge for people of faith today, to let go of the need for literalism and embrace the deeper truths these ancient stories were trying to convey. Truths about justice, mercy, and the cycles of destruction and renewal in human society. And if you are still with me after hearing this, it means you are willing to question the stories you were told as unquestionable fact. And that is exactly why you should subscribe right now, because in this series, we are tearing down illusions layer by layer, uncovering the hidden history behind the Bible's most famous tales. And if you have the courage to keep going, you are the kind of person who will not settle for easy answers. And you need to be here for the final two stories, because what comes next will shake even the most cherished ideas about the origins of language and the authenticity of some of the most beloved moments in the Gospels. So click subscribe and stay with me, because if the flood never happened, then we have to ask, what else did not happen? And the next answer will make you question one of the first stories you ever learned as a child, the Tower of Babel. This is the moment in Genesis where human ambition meets divine intervention, the story of a united humanity, speaking one language, coming together to build a city and a tower that would reach to the heavens, only for God to come down, confuse their language, and scatter them across the earth, creating the nations and tongues we know today. And if you grew up hearing it, the Tower of Babel was presented as the explanation for why people speak different languages and live in different lands, a clear moral about human pride and the limits of human achievement. But what if I told you that there is no historical or linguistic evidence that this ever happened, and in fact, Everything we know about the origin and evolution of languages contradicts the idea of a single sudden event that split humanity into multiple tongues, because modern linguistics shows that languages evolve gradually over thousands of years, branching and shifting as populations migrate, mix, and adapt, not appearing fully formed in a single moment. And the archaeological record of early human civilization shows no sign of a central city from which all people dispersed at once, instead revealing that early urban centers emerged independently in different regions, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley to ancient China, each developing their own languages and writing systems, which means the Tower of Babel story is not history, but something else entirely, and the deeper we look, the clearer its purpose becomes, because the imagery of a great tower in the plains of Shinar, the biblical name for southern Mesopotamia, would have immediately called to mind for ancient audiences the massive step temples known as ziggurats, built by the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians as religious monuments, reaching high into the sky, not as literal attempts to invade heaven, but as symbols of power, culture, and divine connection. And in this light, the Babel story reads like a pointed critique of Babylonian imperialism, a way for Israelite storytellers to frame the great city's monuments as symbols of human arrogance, destined for divine judgment, which makes sense when you remember that Genesis, as we know it, was compiled and edited during or after the Babylonian exile, when Jewish scribes were grappling with the trauma of captivity in a city that boasted massive towers and temples. And what better way to subvert the grandeur of your conqueror than to tell a story in which their greatest architectural symbols are reduced to monuments of foolishness? But if we strip away that historical context and insist on reading Babel as a literal origin story for language, we run into insurmountable problems, because languages like Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Afro-Asiatic, and Proto-Sino-Tibetan can be traced through comparative linguistics to timeframes and geographic origins that long predate any possible setting for Babel, and these linguistic families evolved separately, not from a single point of confusion. So if Babel did not happen literally, what was the point of the story? The answer may be that it was never about explaining languages in a scientific sense, but about warning against the dangers of human unity when it is driven by pride and domination, which makes it an inversion of another famous biblical story, Pentecost, where the confusion of languages is reversed as the apostles speak in tongues and are understood by all, symbolizing unity in diversity under God's Spirit, rather than unity in rebellion. And that thematic link is part of what makes the Babel story powerful. But here is where the tension lies. When we teach it as a literal event, we rob it of that richness and set it up to collapse under historical scrutiny. And the moment someone learns that languages did not suddenly split one afternoon in Mesopotamia, they might dismiss the entire text as a fabrication, when in reality, it is a piece of profound political and theological commentary disguised as a primeval history. But here is the hard truth. For many believers, the early chapters of Genesis are the foundation of their worldview, and to admit that stories like Babel, the flood, and creation are not literal feels like soaring off the branch you are sitting on. Yet what if that branch was never meant to bear the weight of literal history? What if it was meant to carry the weight of meaning, identity, and values? Instead, the ancient authors were not writing science or journalism. They were crafting narratives that spoke to their people's place in the world, and Babel's place in that tapestry is to remind us that no empire, no matter how impressive, can reach heaven through pride alone. And in a way, that is a truth that still stands even if the tower itself never existed. But understanding that requires letting go of the comfort of thinking we have a divine origin story for every mystery in the world, and instead embracing the reality that some of these stories are about the heart, not the past. And as we close in on the final revelation of this series, we turn from the ancient world to the heart of the New Testament, to one of the most beloved and quoted scenes in the life of Jesus, a moment of compassion and moral brilliance that has been preached countless times, illustrated in stained glass and used to teach the meaning of grace. But what if I told you that this scene, as powerful as it is, does not appear in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts of the Bible, that it was likely added centuries later, And that means it may not be a record of something Jesus ever did, and yet it remains one of the most cherished parts of the Gospels. This is the story of Jesus writing in the sand, the woman caught in adultery and the crowd holding stones, and it is where we will end our journey. It is one of the most beautiful and beloved moments in all the Gospels, the scene where religious leaders drag a woman caught in the very act of adultery before Jesus, demanding that he confirm her execution by stoning in accordance with the law of Moses. And instead of responding immediately, he stoops down, writes in the dust with his finger, and when they press him, he stands and utters the unforgettable words, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone," and one by one, the accusers slip away, leaving Jesus alone with the woman, telling her to go and sin no more. A story that has inspired sermons, art, and entire movements of compassion, a scene so deeply ingrained in Christian consciousness that it feels unthinkable to question it. But here is the truth that most churches never tell you. This story does not appear in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts of the Gospel of John. It is absent from the oldest Greek copies, absent from early translations into Syriac, Coptic, and Latin, absent from the writings of the early church fathers when they comment on John, and when it finally does appear in later manuscripts, it shows up in different places, sometimes in John, sometimes in Luke, sometimes with slight variations in wording, which tells scholars that it was almost certainly a later addition, not part of the original gospel text. And this is not the conclusion of a handful of skeptics, but of the vast majority of biblical textual critics across denominations, including conservative scholars, who acknowledge that the earliest versions of John flow seamlessly from chapter 7, verse 52, straight to chapter 8, verse 12, without any mention of a woman caught in adultery or Jesus writing in the sand. And here is where it gets even more intriguing, because even though it was likely added centuries later, the story still resonates so powerfully that many Bible translations today keep it, usually with a note saying it is not in the earliest manuscripts. But this raises the question, if Jesus never actually spoke those words in that moment, does the scene still carry authority? And what does it mean for our view of Scripture if such a central and beloved passage can be a later insertion? For some believers, this is a devastating realization because it undermines the idea that the Gospels are untouched eyewitness accounts. But for others, it is a reminder that the Bible is not a monolithic text dropped from heaven, but a library of writings copied, transmitted, and sometimes expanded by human hands. And here is the deeper tension. Why would early Christians add such a story? The most likely answer is that it circulated orally for generations as a tradition about Jesus, a story that fits so perfectly with his known character and teaching that scribes eventually wrote it into the text, perhaps to preserve it from being lost. But even if that is the case, we cannot escape the fact that it is not original to John, and that means the scene might be a reflection of the church's memory of Jesus rather than a verbatim record of something he did. And this distinction matters because it forces us to confront the reality that the Gospels themselves are layered with history, theology, and tradition, and sometimes those layers are impossible to peel apart without changing the way we read them. And if we are willing to admit that, then we can begin to see the Bible not as a brittle, flawless document that shatters when one detail is questioned, but as a living collection of texts shaped by centuries of faith, memory, and storytelling. And maybe that is what makes it even more powerful, because it means faith is not about defending every single detail as fact, but about engaging with the meaning behind the stories. And now, as we come to the end of this journey through 7 biblical stories that never happened as we were told, the question is not just whether these stories are true in the historical sense, but whether we are willing to face the implications when they are not. We have walked through the ruins of Jericho and found no fallen walls from Joshua's trumpet blast. We have sailed inside the belly of Jonah's fish, only to find it a moral satire. We have wandered the deserts of the Exodus and found no footprints of a nation on the move. We have stood in Bethlehem and heard no cries from Herod's soldiers. We have watched the waters of Noah's flood recede into the realm of myth. We have looked up at Babel's tower and seen not the scattering of tongues, but the slow branching of human speech. And now we have stooped with Jesus in the dust only to realize the scene itself may be a gift from later generations, rather than an eyewitness moment. And after all this, the choice before us is clear. Cling to the safety of unquestioned tradition, or embrace the unsettling, exhilarating path of truth wherever it leads, even when it forces us to rewrite what we thought we knew, because in the end, truth is not. The enemy of faith, dishonesty is, and if your belief cannot survive the light of evidence, then maybe what needs to change is not the evidence, but the belief. So here is my final challenge. If you have made it this far, you are clearly not afraid to ask hard questions. So subscribe right now, because this is just the beginning, and the stories we have yet to uncover will take us even deeper into the history, the myths, and the truths that shape the way we see the Bible and the way we see ourselves. And together we will keep digging until there is nothing left to hide, because the real faith is not in defending illusions, but in facing reality with open eyes and open hearts.